The March on Washington. August 28, 1963, 250,000 demonstrators stood before the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. to protest and shine a light on the inequalities and challenges faced by African Americans. Though a century had passed since emancipation, the need was still great. Tensions had been rising for decades, with marches and protests redirected or held on smaller scales. But after violent attacks on demonstrators in Birmingham and in Selma and in Montgomery and in other places across the South, the stage had been set for a mass protest in the nation's capital. The events of the day are well documented, preserved in history by over 3,000 members of the press. A. Philip Randolph, a true leader and pioneer of the civil rights movement, was the first of many to speak that day. He closed his address with these words: "We here today are only the first wave. When we leave, it will be to carry the civil rights revolution home with us, into every nook and cranny of the land. We shall return again and again to Washington in ever-growing numbers until total freedom is ours." Dr. Rabbi Joachim Prinz was among the speakers of the day. He was not new to the fight for civil rights, though he began his battle in a different country with different challenges. Born in Prussia in 1902, Rabbi Prinz was a bright young man, earning his PhD in philosophy by the age of 21. He felt connected to his Jewish identity from a young age, and after his secular studies, he went on to be ordained a rabbi and dedicate himself to the restoration of German Jewish self-esteem. A vocal opponent of Nazism in pre-war Germany, Prinz was often arrested, but that did not stop him. He continued to preach the value of Judaism and speak out for the civil rights of Jews. After he was expelled from Germany in 1937, Prinz came to the United States, a land where he thought he'd finally be rid of bigotry and hatred, only to come to find a nation where racism against African Americans was rampant. Prinz felt called to the American civil rights movement, having lived such a paralleled experience in Germany. Rabbi Prinz was one of the organizers of the 1963 March on Washington, and he got up to speak that day. He began with the words, "I speak to you as an American Jew. As Americans, we share the profound concern of millions of people about the shame and disgrace of inequality and injustice, which make a mockery of the great American idea. As Jews, we bring to this great demonstration in which thousands of us proudly participate a twofold experience, one of the spirit and one of the history." Rabbi Prinz spoke about a solidarity between the Black and Jewish communities that extended beyond sympathy and compassion. He implored that America must be more than a nation of onlookers, more than a people who stay silent. Rabbi Prinz closed with this reference to the Pledge of Allegiance. He said, "The time, I believe, has come to work together. For it is not enough to hope together, and it is not enough to pray together, to work together that this children's oath pronounced every morning from Maine to California, from north to south, may become a glorious, unshakable reality in a morally renewed and united America." The final speaker of the March on Washington was the young activist who'd been rising to prominence within the movement, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He had agreed to speak last because nobody else wanted to. Other speakers had worried that the press and news teams would leave the protest earlier in the day, afraid that their moment in the light would be missed. But Dr. King didn't mind. He took to the stage with a planned 4-minute speech. 4 minutes is all he had prepared, But Dr. King took to the stage and he spoke for 16 minutes, what would become one of the most famous speeches in all of human history, most of which seems to have come straight from his soul. Amazingly, the words, "I have a dream," were never a part of the plan. Those iconic words, "I have a dream," were the words that naturally traveled from his heart and his mind through the tunnel of his lips, imprinting the words, "I have a dream," on our national consciousness, touching the lives of millions. He famously closed his speech that day with these words: "And when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, 'Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.'" How fitting it is that this weekend we celebrate and honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as it coincides with our Torah portion, B'Shalach. Tomorrow morning we'll read from the book of Exodus. We'll read one of the most visually interesting passages of the entire Torah, Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, a celebration of freedom, of the Israelites' salvation from Egyptian slavery, their safe passage on dry land through the walls of water of the Red Sea. This Shabbat, as Jews and as Americans, we celebrate freedom. We revel in our freedom. We say, "Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai." Who is like you, God, who has brought this freedom upon us? And we call for more freedom, for justice where it still does not prevail. We say, "Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. From every mountainside, let freedom ring." Next year, and every year thereafter, when we again set time aside to honor the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and when we yet again read the Song of the Sea, may we do so in a world with more freedom, with more justice, with more goodness. May we be able to do as Dr. King hoped, to join hands and sing like Miriam the prophetess and the Israelites did as they crossed that sea. Free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Can you hear that song? May this be God's will.